The rhythmic clang of tools echoed through the open bays of Bryant's Auto Works, mingling with the faint hum of a radio tuned to a classic rock station. It was the kind of music that seemed to fit this place perfectly. A no-nonsense, hard-working garage on the outskirts of Denver. I'd spent the better part of my life here, hands covered in grease, lost in the steady flow of fixing what was broken. I was deep into replacing the brake pads on a 2018 Ford truck when my assistant, Jake Fletcher, called out, "Hey Logan, can you take a look at this?" Jake was a good kid, early 20s, sharp and eager to learn. I wiped my hands on a rag and walked over to where he stood, holding up a set of brake rotors. "What am I looking at?" I asked, squinting at the metal discs. Jake rotated one in his hands, pointing to a pattern of strange grooves etched into the surface. "See this scoring here? It's not normal wear and tear. It's deliberate. Someone did this on purpose." I frowned, leaning in closer. He was right. The grooves weren't the result of an aging brake system or neglect. They were too precise, like someone had gone in with a tool to cause the damage. "What kind of person sabotages their own brakes?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "That's a good question," I muttered. "But it's our job to fix it, not figure out why." Jake nodded, though his curiosity lingered. He had the kind of mind that wanted answers to everything, and I admired that about him. Still, some puzzles were better left unsolved, especially ones that hinted at something underhanded. I walked back to the Ford, my thoughts momentarily distracted. Jake's observation nagged at me. Sabotage was rare, but when it happened, it usually pointed to something messy. Bad blood, insurance fraud, or a poor attempt to avoid responsibility. That's the thing about this line of work. Cars can tell stories, but you've got to know how to listen. The workday carried on, the hours blurring together in the way they always did. By mid-afternoon, the garage was filled with the comforting chaos of air tools, engines revving, and Jake humming along to whatever song played on the radio. Then Emily showed up. My wife's arrival at the shop wasn't uncommon. She'd swing by from time to drop off lunch or chat about her day. But this time she wasn't alone. Nathan Mercer walked in beside her, his broad shoulders and overly confident stride making him impossible to miss. I'd met Nathan a few times before. He was one of Emily's business associates, a project manager for a local real estate firm she worked with. "Hey Logan," Emily said, her voice cheerful but just a little too bright. "Got a minute?" I straightened up, wiping my hands on a towel. "Sure. What's up?" Emily glanced at Nathan, who gave me a firm handshake and a practiced smile. "Just wanted to talk insurance stuff," Nathan said, his tone casual but overly smooth. "Emily thought you might be able to help us out." I raised an eyebrow. "Insurance? For what?" "Our fleet vehicles," Emily chimed in. "Nathan's company is looking to update their coverage, and I figured you'd have some good advice." I nodded slowly, though something about the way Emily avoided my eyes put me on edge. "I can give you a few recommendations," I said, my tone measured. Nathan stepped closer, his confidence practically oozing from every word. "We really appreciate it, Logan. Always heard you were the guy to talk to when it came to cars and all things related." The compliment felt hollow, like he'd rehearsed it. Emily shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the shop as Jake walked by with an armful of tools. "It's so busy in here," she said, forcing a laugh. "We're staying steady," I replied, watching her carefully. Nathan's phone buzzed, and he pulled it from his pocket. "I've got to step outside and take this," he said, flashing a polite smile. "Thanks for your time, Logan. We'll follow up soon." He walked out, leaving Emily and me alone. She ran a hand through her hair, a nervous habit I'd seen 100 times before. "You okay?" I asked. "Yeah," she said quickly. "I just wanted to stop by and say hi. You've been working so much lately, and I thought it'd be nice to check in." Her words sounded right, but her body language told a different story. I leaned back against the workbench, crossing my arms. "Everything all right with Nathan?" Emily hesitated, just for a moment, before forcing a smile. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" It was a simple answer, but the way she said it set off a quiet alarm in my head. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling Emily's visit had left me with. Something about her nervousness, combined with Nathan's overly smooth demeanor, didn't sit right. I replayed the interaction in my mind as I worked on the Ford's brake system, my hands moving instinctively while my thoughts wandered. Emily and I had been married for 8 years. We'd had our ups and downs like any couple, but there had always been a sense of trust between us, or so I thought. The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Why was she so nervous? And why did Nathan feel the need to join her for something as simple as insurance advice? Jake interrupted my thoughts as he walked over with a clipboard. "Hey, Logan, do you think we should?" He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing as he studied my face. "You okay? You've been quiet since lunch." "I'm fine," I said quickly. "Just got a lot on my mind." Jake didn't push, but I could tell he didn't believe me. That evening, after the shop had closed and Jake had gone home, I sat in the office staring at the stacks of invoices and work orders on my desk. The day's events played over and over in my mind, each detail adding another layer to the unease I couldn't shake. Emily's behavior, Nathan's too confident charm, the strange tension in the air. I had no concrete reason to suspect anything was wrong, but my instincts told me otherwise. And if there's one thing I'd learned from years of working on cars, it's that ignoring the warning signs never ends well. The day should have ended like any other. Tools packed away, invoices filed, and the shop doors locked. But Jake's observation about the brake rotors lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. Sabotage didn't just happen out of nowhere, and even in the auto business, deliberate damage usually pointed to a motive far beyond a bad brake job. Jake was already gone for the day, his curiosity about the rotors set aside for another time. But as I leaned against the workbench, watching the last rays of the sun filter through the bay doors, I couldn't stop replaying the details of what he'd pointed out. It wasn't just the grooves in the metal, it was the fact that someone had gone to the trouble of creating them. It didn't make sense. Still here, Bobby Caldwell's gravelly voice pulled me out of my thoughts. Bobby ran the office with the kind of efficiency that made the shop run like clockwork. Former military, retired early, and sharp as a tack, he was the guy you wanted on your side when things got messy. "Yeah," I said, exhaling slowly, just wrapping my head around something. Bobby leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "Jake mentioned the brake rotors earlier. I don't like it." "Neither do I admitted. "Speaking of things I don't like," Bobby added, his tone shifting, "your buddy Nathan's been around a lot lately. Always got some helpful business ideas." He used air quotes, his skepticism clear. "What kind of ideas?" "Nothing solid," Bobby replied. "Just vague talk about expanding your fleet servicing, pulling in corporate accounts. The guy's all charm and no substance. And frankly, he doesn't belong here." I nodded, filing that away as yet another reason to be suspicious. Nathan had always struck me as someone who liked to insert himself where he didn't belong, but now it was starting to feel personal. That evening, as I sat in the office finishing up paperwork, I decided to review the shop's surveillance footage. It wasn't something I did often, but something about the day had set me on edge, and I needed answers, even if I didn't know what questions I was asking yet. I clicked through hours of footage, watching the usual bustle of cars coming and going, customers chatting with Bobby, and Jake hustling between jobs. Everything seemed normal until I spotted Nathan. The timestamp was from earlier that week. Nathan had arrived in his sleek black sedan, stepped out with his usual swagger, and gone straight to Emily, who was already waiting in the parking lot. Their conversation looked casual at first, just two colleagues chatting. But as I rewound and played the clip again, I noticed the small details. The way she leaned in when he spoke. The way he touched her arm lightly, just for a second too long. It was subtle, but it was enough to make my chest tighten. Later in the footage I caught them again, this time at a nearby cafe. I recognized the place. It was a couple of blocks from the shop, the kind of spot Emily liked to frequent. They sat in a booth near the window, their body language relaxed but too close. The cafe wasn't somewhere I would have expected a business meeting to take place. I shut the laptop abruptly, the unease growing into something heavier. The night stretched on, the quiet of the shop interrupted only by the occasional sound of cars passing on the main road. I was getting ready to head home when my phone buzzed on the desk. The message that popped up wasn't from Emily, Bobby, or Jake. It wasn't a number I recognized either. Unknown number. The network is active again. They're looking for you. Be careful. My stomach dropped. I stared at the message. The words blurring as memories I'd worked so hard to bury came rushing back. The network. It had been nearly 15 years since I'd heard that name, but it was impossible to forget. The last time I'd been involved with them was during an op in Belgrade, an op that had gone catastrophically wrong. The network was a shadowy organization, part mercenaries, part covert operatives, with ties to intelligence agencies that didn't officially exist. They operated in the gray areas of geopolitics, where plausible deniability was the rule and morality was an afterthought. I had been young, cocky, and willing to take risks back then, but Belgrade changed everything. The mission was supposed to be straightforward. Secure intel, extract a target, and disappear. Instead, it turned into a bloodbath. I barely got out alive, and I'd spent years afterward erasing every trace of my involvement. The message on my phone made it clear that my past wasn't as buried as I'd thought. I typed out a quick reply. "Who is this?" No response came. By the time I got home, the unease from the shop had morphed into a full-blown storm in my mind. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat at the kitchen table, the weight of the day pressing down on me. Emily was already asleep, or pretending to be. Her usual cheerful good night had been replaced by silence, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was guilt that kept her quiet. I stared at my phone, the message still open on the screen, and replayed the events of the past few weeks. Emily's nervous behavior, Nathan's unwelcome presence, the brake rotors, and now this, a ghost from my past reaching out with a cryptic warning. I thought about Belgrade, about the faces I'd left behind, and the one face I couldn't forget, Dominic Adler. He had been my partner on that mission, a man whose loyalty I had never questioned, until the moment he betrayed me. Dominic had been the reason the mission fell apart, the reason I barely made it out alive. If the network was active again, and Dominic was involved, I knew one thing for sure: trouble was coming. The next morning, I arrived at the shop earlier than usual. Bobby was already there, nursing a cup of black coffee and flipping through invoices. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said, his eyes narrowing. "I didn't," I admitted. Bobby set his coffee down. "What's going on, Logan?" I hesitated, debating how much to tell him. Bobby wasn't just an employee, he was a friend, someone who had proven his loyalty time and time again. "Do you remember Belgrade?" I asked finally. His expression darkened. "Yeah, I remember. I got a message last night," I said, sliding my phone across the desk. Bobby read it, his jaw tightening. "You think this is legit?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but I'm not taking any chances." Bobby nodded, his tone serious. "Then we start watching our backs." I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. My past was closing in, and the life I had built, my shop, my marriage, my friends, was suddenly on shaky ground. I didn't know who I could trust anymore, but one thing was certain. The cracks in my world were growing wider. The sound of the shop's roll-up doors groaning open echoed through the morning air. As sunlight spilled across the garage floor, I stood at my workbench, staring at the brake rotor Jake had brought to me the day before. The grooves felt more deliberate now than they had when I first saw them, a precision that hinted at intent, not accident. I turned the metal disc over in my hands, replaying every strange detail of the past few weeks. Emily's nervous behavior, Nathan's unnecessary charm, and now this, the realization that the sabotage might be part of a larger pattern. Jake arrived a few minutes later, his usual energy dimmed by a sleepless night. "Morning, Logan," he said, rubbing his eyes. "Morning," I replied. "Got a minute?" "Sure," he said, walking over. I held up the rotor. "This isn't an isolated incident, is it?" Jake hesitated, his brow furrowing. "I don't think so. I've been looking at some of the diagnostics we've done over the past month, and there are patterns. Vehicles coming in with the same kind of damage. Brakes, fuel lines, electrical systems. Things that don't usually fail like that unless someone's messing with them. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? I wasn't sure, Jake admitted. But after yesterday, I started digging into the service records. I'll print them out for you. I nodded, a knot forming in my stomach. The brake rotors weren't just a fluke. Someone was deliberately tampering with vehicles before they came to us. Thanks, Jake, I said. Keep this between us for now. As the day unfolded, I found myself watching the shop more closely. Every detail, every interaction, felt like a piece of a larger puzzle I was just beginning to assemble. By mid-afternoon, my focus shifted to Walter Sanderson. Walter was an older mechanic who had been with the shop for years. Quiet, reliable, and meticulous. But over the past few weeks, I'd noticed him staying late, often long after the rest of us had gone home. At first, I chalked it up to his perfectionism. Walter had always been the kind of guy who double-checked his work, even when it wasn't necessary. But something about his recent behavior didn't sit right. I pulled up the shop surveillance footage, fast-forwarding through hours of grainy recordings. Sure enough, there he was, wandering the garage late at night, flashlight in hand. Walter wasn't just inspecting his work. He was checking compartments that should have remained closed, peeking into tool cabinets, and opening storage boxes meant for sensitive parts. My chest tightened as I realized the implications. Walter wasn't just staying late to work. He was looking for something, or hiding something. That evening, after the shop had closed, I sat in the office combing through more footage. My unease deepened when I stumbled across a clip of Grace Turner, one of Emily's closest friends. Grace wasn't someone who frequented the shop. She was a sharp, polished woman who worked in finance. A stark contrast to the grease and grit of my world. Seeing her on the shop's cameras after hours, standing beside Emily and discussing what looked like financial documents, set off every alarm in my head. I zoomed in on the footage, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Emily was holding a folder, flipping through pages while Grace pointed to something on the papers. Their body language wasn't casual. It was purposeful, focused. It wasn't the kind of meeting two friends had for fun. Grace's presence added another layer of complexity to the web forming in my mind. She and Nathan weren't just acquaintances. They were orchestrating something larger. I started piecing together what I knew, each thread connecting to the next. The brake rotor sabotage, Walter's late-night inspections, Grace's financial expertise, Nathan's too frequent visits, Emily's nervous behavior. Couldn't be a coincidence. Whatever was happening wasn't just about me. It was bigger, something involving the shop, Emily, and possibly even Nathan's connections. As the hours stretched on, I found myself replaying conversations with Emily, looking for clues I might have missed. Her insistence on discussing insurance with Nathan. Her reluctance to meet my eyes when I asked about their work together. I thought back to the cafe footage, the way she leaned toward Nathan like they shared a secret. What were they hiding? The next day, I confronted Walter. Hey, Walter, I said casually as he worked on a customer's car. Got a minute? He glanced up, wiping his hands on a rag. What's up, boss? I leaned against the car, keeping my tone neutral. Noticed you've been staying late a lot. Everything okay? Walter hesitated, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. Yeah, just catching up on work. Don't want to fall behind. You sure that's all it is? I asked, letting the question hang in the air. He shifted uncomfortably. What else would it be? I studied him for a moment, weighing my next words. If there's something you need to tell me, now's the time. Walter opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, shaking his head. Nope, just doing my job, Logan. I nodded slowly, though I didn't believe him. Walter was hiding something, but I wasn't sure what or why. That evening, I sat down with Bobby in the office. We've got a problem, I said, laying out everything I'd uncovered. Bobby listened intently, his expression growing darker with each detail. You think Emily's in on it? He asked finally. I don't know, I admitted, but she's involved somehow. Grace, Nathan, Walter. They're all connected, and Emily's right in the middle of it. Bobby nodded thoughtfully. What's your plan? Keep digging, I said. If this is about the shop, I need to know why. If it's about me, I need to know that too. Bobby leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. You think it could be tied to your past? The thought had crossed my mind more than once. The message about the network was still fresh in my memory, a reminder that the shadows I thought I'd escaped might still be lurking. Maybe, I said quietly, but right now, I'm focused on what's happening here. One step at a time. Bobby nodded. Let me know what you need. As I locked up the shop that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the edge of something much bigger than I realized. The shop was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place where I could leave the chaos of the past behind. But now it felt like a battleground with enemies I couldn't yet see. And at the center of it all was Emily. I wasn't sure whether to see her as an accomplice or a pawn, but one thing was certain. The harmony I'd once believed in was gone. The weeks that followed felt like walking through a darkened maze, each turn revealing something more unsettling than the last. The shop, once my refuge, now felt like a stage where unseen forces were orchestrating something far larger than I had imagined. My suspicions about Walter deepened after I ran a background check on him. The results were troubling. For someone who claimed to have spent decades as a mechanic, his employment history was oddly patchy. Gaps in the timeline that couldn't be explained away as sabbaticals or career changes. The deeper I dug, the more inconsistencies I found. Then came the name, the Gray Circles. It appeared in a flagged document tied to one of Walter's past employers, a now-defunct logistics company based out of Serbia. The name was like a punch to the gut. I hadn't heard of the Gray Circles since the mission in Belgrade, the one that had gone catastrophically wrong. They weren't just a criminal network. They were the kind of organization that thrived in the shadows, pulling strings behind the scenes. Smuggling, espionage, blackmail, they had their hands in everything. My mission in Belgrade had been to dismantle one of their operations, and it ended in disaster. Now, it seemed they were back, and Walter's presence in my shop wasn't a coincidence. Meanwhile, the surveillance footage I'd been combing through painted an increasingly damning picture of Emily's involvement. Nathan's frequent visits to the shop weren't just about casual business ideas or insurance discussions. The footage showed him and Emily in quiet, intense conversations that stretched far longer than they should have. At first, their interactions seemed innocent enough, but subtle shifts in body language told a different story. Nathan would lean in closer, speaking in a low, controlled tone. Emily, always fidgeting with her hair or the edge of her sleeve, looked like someone caught in a web she couldn't untangle herself from. The most damning footage came late one night, well after the shop had closed. Grace joined them this time, carrying a leather folder that I recognized immediately. It was the one Emily had brought to the cafe weeks earlier. The three of them stood near Emily's car, their expressions serious. Grace opened the folder, showing them something I couldn't see on the camera, but the way Nathan gestured and Emily's face tightened told me it wasn't good. Grace wasn't just a bystander in this mess. She was a key player, and whatever she had brought to that meeting was driving the entire operation forward. The puzzle pieces were starting to come together, and the picture they formed wasn't pretty. Nathan wasn't just some charming business associate. He was an agent of manipulation, carefully pulling strings to push Emily, and, by extension, me, into a vulnerable position. Emily, while not fully aware of the scope of what was happening, had been roped into decisions she couldn't easily walk away from. Her nervous behavior, her reluctance to meet my eyes. It all made sense now. But the question that haunted me was, why? Why me? Why the shop? The answer, I suspected, lay in my past. The Gray Circles weren't the kind of organization that forgot or forgave. If Walter was connected to them, then it stood to reason that Nathan, Grace, and even Emily were being used as pawns in a larger scheme. And I was their target. One night, I stayed late at the shop, going through every inch of the place with a fine-tooth comb. If Walter had been hiding something here, or planting something, I needed to find it. I started with the tool cabinets, checking for any signs of tampering or misplaced equipment. Then I moved to the storage compartments where we kept spare parts, running my hands over every surface for anything that felt out of place. It wasn't until I reached the office that I found it. Tucked behind a filing cabinet was a small device, barely the size of a deck of cards. I recognized it immediately, a listening device. Walter had been spying on me, likely feeding information to whoever was pulling the strings behind the scenes. I held the device in my hands, anger simmering beneath the surface. This wasn't just sabotage anymore, it was surveillance. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to mess with my business. They were watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The next day, I called Bobby into the office and showed him the device. His expression darkened as he studied it. "This isn't amateur work," he said. "This is high-grade surveillance tech. Someone's serious about keeping tabs on you." "I know," I said quietly. "What's the plan?" I leaned back in my chair, staring at the network map I'd started pinning to the wall. Nathan, Grace, Walter, Emily, they were all connected, and the threads led back to something much bigger. "We take control of the narrative," I said. "No more waiting for them to make the next move. It's time we push back." Bobby nodded. "Whatever you need, I'm in." Over the next few days, I began preparing the shop for what felt like an inevitable confrontation. I installed additional security measures, hidden cameras, motion sensors, and a backup generator for the surveillance system. I also updated Bobby and Jake on what I'd found, though I kept the details about Belgrade and the gray circles to myself. Jake, ever the curious one, started digging into Walter's activities on his own. He didn't have the same resources I did, but his instincts were sharp, and his findings only reinforced what I already suspected. Walter was working against me. Meanwhile, I began reaching out to old contacts from my past. People I hadn't spoken to in years but who still owed me favors. If the gray circles were involved, I needed every advantage I could get. Then came the tipping point. Late one night, as I reviewed yet another set of surveillance footage, I caught something that made my blood run cold. Nathan and Grace were in the shop after hours, standing near the bay where we kept our most expensive diagnostic equipment. Nathan was holding something in his hand, a small black box that looked eerily similar to the listening device I'd found earlier. He handed it to Grace, who nodded and slipped it into her bag. This wasn't just a random act of sabotage. This was deliberate, calculated, and it was time to put an end to it. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen as the video played on a loop. The next move was mine. The hum of the shop felt louder than usual that morning, a kind of tension simmering beneath the surface that no one could see but me. Every piece of the plan was in place, and all I needed was for Walter to make his move. Over the past few days, I had adjusted the shop's security system, adding hidden cameras and motion sensors in key locations. Bobby and Jake were in the loop, each of them playing their part without asking too many questions. Jake, in particular, had taken to his role like a natural. His curiosity and tech-savvy instincts made him an invaluable ally. "You sure this'll work?" Jake asked quietly as we prepped for the day's work. "It'll work," I said, my voice calm. "Walter thinks he's running the game, but he's walking into a trap." The first sign of trouble came just before lunch. Walter had been hovering near the office, fiddling with his toolbox and glancing over his shoulder more often than usual. I kept my distance, pretending to focus on a carburetor rebuild while watching him out of the corner of my eye. Then, when he thought no one was looking, Walter made his move. He slid a small object, a USB drive, into the shop's central diagnostic computer. From my position, I couldn't see what he was doing on the screen, but the hidden cameras I'd installed captured everything. Walter's plan was clear. Plant incriminating files on the system to make it look like I was running illegal operations out of the shop. What Walter didn't know was that the diagnostic computer was connected to a secondary system, one I'd set up specifically to record and monitor his activity. Every keystroke, every file he accessed, every move he made was being recorded in real time. When Walter finished, he turned and froze. Bobby stood in the doorway, arms crossed and an expression that could cut steel. "Going somewhere, Walter?" Bobby asked, his voice low and steady. Walter's hand twitched toward his toolbox, but Bobby didn't budge. "Don't bother," I said, stepping out from behind the workbench. "We've got everything we need." Walter's eyes darted between us, his confidence slipping with every passing second. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, though his voice wavered. Sure you don't, Bobby said, motioning toward the security office. Let's take a look, shall we? In the security office, I pulled up the footage of Walter planting the USB drive. The screen showed him clearly, his actions undeniable. You were saying? I asked, turning to face him. Walter's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. I didn't have a choice, he muttered. You always have a choice, I said firmly. But you made the wrong one. Now start talking. For a moment it looked like he might try to lie his way out of it, but the weight of the evidence, and the calm resolve in my tone, seemed to break him. Walter sat down heavily, running a hand over his face. All right, he said. I'll tell you what you want to know. What Walter revealed was both illuminating and chilling. He admitted to being part of a group that had been targeting me for months, though he claimed he didn't know the full extent of the operation. His orders came from Nathan Mercer, who was acting as a middleman for someone higher up the chain. Simon Keller. Simon's name was one I hadn't heard in years, but it hit me like a freight train. Simon Keller was a ghost, a shadowy figure who had been pulling strings behind the scenes for as long as I'd been in the game. He had ties to the gray circles and was known for targeting people who had crossed them in the past. It's not just you, Walter said. There are others. Simon's been cleaning house, taking out loose ends. Nathan's job was to get close to your wife, make her trust him, and then push you into a corner. What's the end game? I asked. Walter hesitated. If I had to guess, they want you to fold. Give up the shop, your assets, everything. They want to leave you with nothing. I nodded slowly, piecing it together. Simon wasn't just trying to punish me for Belgrade. He was dismantling my life piece by piece, using people like Nathan, Grace, and Walter to do his dirty work. Just as Walter finished his confession, he made a move to stand, his eyes darting toward the door. Don't even think about it, Bobby said, stepping in his path. I'm done, Walter said, his voice trembling. I've told you everything I know. Let me go. Not yet, I said. You've got one more job. Walter frowned. What job? You're going to help me send Simon a message, I said. My tone as cold as the Denver winter. Walter's eyes widened, but he nodded reluctantly. Over the next few hours, Jake and I worked to secure the evidence Walter had provided. Between the surveillance footage, the files from the USB drive, and Walter's confession, we had enough to expose Nathan and Grace's involvement, and to make Simon Keller think twice about targeting me. Jake's undercover work proved invaluable. He'd been tracking Nathan's communications with Emily, and the messages painted a clear picture of manipulation. Nathan had been feeding Emily lies, convincing her that I was hiding things from her, while pushing her to make decisions that benefited Simon's agenda. Emily, though entangled in the mess, wasn't beyond saving. She'd been used as a pawn just like the others. By the time the day ended, the shop felt like it was on lockdown. Every piece of evidence was secured, every loose end tied up. Walter's attempt to flee had been thwarted, and though he wasn't off the hook, his cooperation had bought him a sliver of redemption. As I stood in the office, staring at the network map pinned to the wall, I felt a sense of clarity. The web Simon Keller had spun was vast, but it wasn't impenetrable. The next stage of the battle would be the most dangerous yet, but I was ready. Simon Keller wanted to dismantle my life. I was about to show him how wrong he was. The game had shifted. For weeks, I'd been on the defensive, unraveling the web of sabotage and manipulation that Simon Keller had spun around me. But now, with Walter's confession and Jake's investigation confirming Keller's next move, it was time to go on the offensive. I sat in the office late that night, reviewing everything we had. The surveillance footage, the planted listening devices, the forged financial records. It all painted a damning picture of the lengths Keller's network had gone to dismantle my life. But I had something they didn't, a network of my own. The first step was exposing Grace Turner. She wasn't just a pawn in this game. She was a key player. Her ties to Keller's operations ran deep, and her real estate dealings had a trail of irregularities that Jake had flagged during his quiet investigation. With the help of an old contact, Evan Carter, a no-nonsense investigator who specialized in white-collar crimes. I submitted an anonymous tip to the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies. Within days, Grace's name was flagged for questionable property transactions, including shell companies used to launder money. She didn't know it yet, but the walls were closing in on her. Nathan Mercer was next. Jake's digging into Nathan's financial records had uncovered more than we expected. Offshore accounts tied to fraudulent insurance policies, suspicious payments to intermediaries, and unexplained transfers linked directly to Keller's operations. "Do you think this is enough?" Jake asked as he handed me the folder of evidence. I flipped through the pages, my jaw tightening as I read. "It's more than enough." With the evidence in hand, I contacted an old ally at the Denver District Attorney's office. I didn't need to explain much. Nathan's financial dealings spoke for themselves. By the end of the week, subpoenas were issued, and Nathan's carefully constructed facade began to crack. Meanwhile, Emily was starting to see the truth. Her late-night conversations with Nathan, once filled with promises of success and security, had taken a darker tone. Nathan's charm was wearing thin, replaced by a manipulative insistence that she push forward with the insurance policies he'd been advocating for. One night, as I reviewed surveillance footage from the shop, I caught something that changed everything. Emily had stayed late to go over paperwork, and she stumbled across a file Nathan had left behind, a folder containing forged insurance documents with her name attached. I watched as her face shifted from confusion to shock. She flipped through the papers, her hands shaking, then reached for her phone. She called Nathan, her voice trembling as she confronted him. "What is this?" she demanded. "You told me this was legitimate." Nathan's response was calm, calculated. "It is, Emily. You're just misunderstanding the process." "Misunderstanding?" she snapped. "You're using my name for your scams. How could you?" Nathan cut her off, his voice growing colder. "Calm down, Emily. You're in this now, whether you like it or not." Emily hung up, the anger and fear on her face unmistakable. As Emily began to pull away from Nathan, Jake's investigation confirmed what I'd suspected. Simon Keller was on his way to Denver, and he wasn't coming alone. "They're bringing a team," Jake said, his voice tense. 5 or 6 people, maybe more. "They're planning something big." I nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. Keller wasn't the type to leave loose ends, and if he was coming here personally, it meant he intended to finish what he'd started. But I wasn't going to let him. I spent the next few days turning the shop into a fortress. Every camera, every sensor, every backup system was tested and retested. I installed additional locks on the office doors and reinforced the garage's main entrance. Bobby and Jake were fully briefed, ready to act the moment Keller's team made their move. I also set traps, subtle, non-lethal measures designed to neutralize anyone who tried to corner me. Pressure sensors were placed under floor mats in the bays, linked to alarms that would trigger the moment they were stepped on. Hidden cameras covered every angle, ensuring I had eyes on every part of the shop. It wasn't just about defense, it was about control. I needed to stay one step ahead, anticipating Keller's moves before he made them. The night Keller arrived, the air was electric with tension. Jake spotted their convoy first, 2 black SUVs pulling into the industrial park a block away from the shop. He radioed in from his vantage point, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "They're here," he said. "Looks like 6 of them, including Keller." "Understood," I replied, my tone calm. "Stick to the plan." Bobby and I were positioned in the office, watching the surveillance feed as the SUVs parked near the shop. Keller stepped out first, his presence as commanding as ever. Even after all these years, he hadn't changed much, tall, sharp-eyed, and exuding the quiet menace of someone used to getting his way. The others followed, fanning out around the perimeter. They moved with precision, checking every door and window like a tactical unit. I let them come. The first alarm triggered when one of Keller's men stepped on a pressure sensor near the back entrance. The sharp, piercing sound echoed through the shop, startling the intruders and forcing them to regroup. On the surveillance feed, I watched as Keller's calm exterior began to crack. He barked orders, trying to regain control of the situation, but the chaos I'd created was working against him. Bobby activated the shop's external floodlights, flooding the area with blinding white light. The intruders scrambled for cover, their movements now fully visible on the cameras. It wasn't long before they realized they were outmatched. One by one, Keller's men began retreating, their confidence shattered. Keller, however, stayed behind, his expression dark as he stared directly into one of the cameras. "This isn't over, Logan," he said, his voice low and venomous. I leaned closer to the microphone connected to the shop's PA system. "You're right, Simon," I replied. "It's just beginning." By the time Keller and his team retreated, the shop was silent again. Jake and Bobby joined me in the office, their expressions a mix of relief and determination. "What now?" Jake asked. I looked at the network map on the wall, the connections between Keller, Nathan, Grace, and the gray circles clearer than ever. "Now we take the fight to them," I said. The shop was quiet, the kind of stillness that makes every sound feel louder, every shadow deeper. It was well past midnight, and I stood in the office watching the security feed. The cameras showed empty bays, neat rows of tools, and the faint glow of motion sensors embedded in the walls. Everything was ready. Simon Keller and his team were coming, and this time the game would end on my terms. Jake's voice crackled over the radio from his post in a car parked a block away. "They're here. 2 SUVs, same as last time. They're pulling into the lot now." "Got it," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "Stay in position." "Bobby, you ready?" "Always," Bobby said from his spot near the shop's back entrance. "Let's see how these guys handle the unexpected." The SUVs rolled to a stop outside, and the doors opened in unison. Simon stepped out first, his presence as commanding as ever. He was dressed impeccably, as if this were a business meeting rather than a covert operation. Behind him, his operatives moved with precision, fanning out around the shop in practiced formation. I took a deep breath, watching as they approached the front entrance. My traps were set, my defenses ready. All that was left was to spring the net. The first disruption came as soon as Simon's team crossed the threshold. Pressure sensors embedded in the floor triggered a series of mechanical responses. Heavy-duty shutters slammed down over the exterior windows, floodlights illuminated every corner of the shop, and a loud, disorienting alarm blared through the space. On the cameras, I watched Simon's operatives freeze, their carefully rehearsed movements thrown into chaos. They scrambled for cover, their earpieces buzzing with confused chatter. Simon, however, didn't flinch. He stood in the middle of the shop, surveying the scene with cold, calculating eyes. "Logan," he called out, his voice cutting through the noise. "Enough with the theatrics. Let's talk." I grabbed the handheld mic connected to the shop's PA system. "You've got my attention, Simon. What do you want?" Simon tilted his head, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "You already know the answer to that. Let's not waste time pretending otherwise." "Then you already know my answer," I replied. "I'm not folding, Simon. Not now, not ever." As Simon's team tried to regroup, I activated the second phase of my plan. Motion sensors detected their movements, triggering bursts of high-frequency sound designed to disorient without causing harm. The operatives stumbled, their hands flying to their ears as they tried to regain their bearings. Simon barked orders, his frustration starting to show. "Stay focused. He's just trying to rattle us." He wasn't wrong, but he also wasn't prepared for what came next. I activated the hidden speakers scattered throughout the shop, broadcasting recordings of Walter's confession and Nathan's incriminating conversations. The operatives stopped in their tracks, their faces a mix of confusion and realization as they heard the evidence of their network's corruption played back to them. Simon's smirk vanished. "This is over, Simon," I said through the PA system. "Your operation, your influence, your lies. It all ends tonight." Eventually, Simon called off his team. "Stand down," he ordered, his voice sharp. "This isn't the place." The operatives hesitated but complied, retreating toward the shop's entrance. Simon stayed behind, his eyes fixed on the camera mounted above the office door. "Let's settle this, Logan. Face to face." I considered my options for a moment before nodding to Bobby, who was watching from the surveillance room. Cut the traps. Let him through. The alarms and lights shut off, leaving the shop in an uneasy silence. Simon walked toward the office with measured steps, his expression unreadable. When he stepped inside, it was just the two of us. Simon Keller, the man who had haunted my past and tried to destroy my present, stood across from me, his hands clasped behind his back. "You've been busy," he said, his tone almost admiring. "I had to be," I replied evenly. "You don't leave people much choice." Simon chuckled softly. "You always were resourceful, Logan. It's one of the things I respected about you. Respect doesn't mean much when it's coming from a man who sent people to sabotage my life." His smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "This was never personal, Logan. You were a loose end, part of a larger picture. The gray circles needed closure, and you were standing in the way. And now," I asked, taking a step closer. "Now I see that you're more trouble than you're worth," he admitted. "But let's not pretend you're blameless in all this. Belgrade wasn't exactly your finest moment." Belgrade. The mission that had gone so wrong, the ghosts of which had followed me for years. But I wasn't the same man I'd been back then. "Belgrade was a mistake," I said. "But this, what you've done, goes far beyond anything I was involved in." Simon shrugged. "Perspective." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a flash drive, holding it up for him to see. "This isn't perspective, Simon. This is evidence. Everything you and your network have been doing, every scam, every betrayal, every illegal deal. It's all here." For the first time, Simon's composure cracked. "You think you can just hand that over to the authorities and walk away?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't think, Simon. I know." What Simon didn't realize was that the evidence had already been sent to my trusted allies. Evan Carter at the DA's office, Megan from my past cases, and others who had the power to dismantle his operation. This wasn't just about me. It was about dismantling the gray circles piece by piece, ensuring they couldn't hurt anyone else the way they tried to hurt me. Simon's jaw tightened as he realized the truth. "You've made a powerful enemy, Logan." "No, Simon," I said, my voice calm. "You've lost your power." By the time Simon left the shop, his operation was in shambles. His team had scattered, his influence was unraveling, and the evidence against him was already in the hands of people who could bring him to justice. I stood in the empty shop, the silence now feeling less like tension and more like relief. The fight wasn't over, not completely. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my life again. Months after Simon Keller and his operatives walked out of my shop for the last time, life felt different. Steadier, clearer, and full of purpose. The confrontation had left scars, both visible and unseen, but it also left me with something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. The gray circles were finished. The evidence we'd collected, Walter's confession, Nathan's financial records, and Grace's shady dealings, had been more than enough to dismantle the network. Authorities had moved swiftly, freezing accounts, issuing warrants, and exposing the web of corruption that Simon had worked so hard to protect. The aftermath left me standing at a crossroads. For years, I had focused on surviving, keeping my head down, and running the shop. But after everything I'd been through, I realized that survival wasn't enough anymore. It was time to rebuild, not just for myself but for the people who had been caught in schemes like mine. The transformation started small. Bobby and I sat in the office one night, going over plans for the shop's expansion. We wanted to do more than just fix cars. The shop had been my safe haven, a place where I found purpose when the rest of the world seemed determined to tear me apart. Now, I wanted it to be that for others, too. "We could start with a second location," Bobby suggested, tracing his finger over a map of Denver. "Commerce City, maybe? There's a need for good shops out there, and we could reach people who wouldn't normally have access to what we're offering." I nodded. "It's not just about the cars. We can create spaces where people feel safe, where they know someone's looking out for them." "Safe havens," Bobby said thoughtfully. "I like the sound of that." Jake was all in from the beginning. His tech skills had been a game-changer during the confrontation with Keller, and now he was using those same skills to help build a network of secure systems for the shop. "You know," Jake said one afternoon as he installed new surveillance equipment, "we could integrate this into all the new locations, make it part of what we offer. Not just repairs, but protection." I smiled. "You're thinking ahead, Jake. I like it." Emily left Denver a month after the confrontation. Our final conversation was short but sincere. She came by the shop early one morning, her eyes heavy with regret but resolute in her decision. "I can't stay here, Logan," she said, her voice quiet. "Too many mistakes. Too many memories." I nodded, understanding more than I let on. "What will you do?" "I'm not sure," she admitted. "But I need to figure out who I am outside of all this. Outside of Nathan, Keller, everything." There was no anger left in me. No desire for vengeance or bitterness. Emily had been manipulated just like so many others. Her mistakes had cost us. But in the end, she had chosen to walk away from the lies and start over. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I said. She gave me a small, sad smile. "I hope you do too." As she drove away, I felt a sense of closure. Emily's chapter in my life was over, but I didn't carry the weight of it anymore. The shop's transformation continued, growing into something I hadn't thought possible. We expanded to 3 locations across Denver, each one designed not just as an auto repair business, but as a community hub. We partnered with local organizations to offer resources for people who had been targeted by scams, manipulations, or networks like the Gray Circles. Jake became my right-hand man, taking on more responsibilities and helping train new employees who shared our vision. Bobby, ever the steady presence, oversaw operations with his characteristic precision, ensuring that every shop ran like clockwork. The shop became more than just a business, it became a lifeline for people looking to rebuild, just as I had. Grace Turner wasn't so lucky. Her involvement in Keller's network came to light during the investigations, and the regulatory authorities uncovered a mountain of evidence linking her to fraudulent real estate deals and money laundering. She faced criminal charges, and the public exposure of her actions left her isolated and disgraced. Nathan, too, faced his reckoning. With his financial records exposed, he had no choice but to cooperate with authorities, offering information on Keller's operations in exchange for a reduced sentence. His charm and manipulation couldn't save him this time, and he faded into obscurity, just another cog in Keller's broken machine. As for Keller, his empire was in ruins. The Gray Circles had been dismantled, their influence shattered. Simon had always been a man who thrived in the shadows, but with every secret exposed, his power evaporated. I didn't need to know where he ended up. All that mattered was that he was no longer a threat. The turning point for me came one quiet evening at the shop. I was working on a 1965 Mustang, the kind of car that reminded me why I fell in love with this job in the first place. The smell of oil and metal, the feel of the tools in my hands, it was grounding, a reminder of who I was at my core. Jake walked in, holding a stack of flyers. "We're all set for the grand opening of the new location," he said, his excitement contagious. "Good work, Jake," I said, setting down my wrench. He hesitated, then added, "You know, none of this would have happened without you. The shop, the network, everything. You've turned this place into something amazing." I smiled, clapping him on the shoulder. It wasn't just me. It was all of us. The Ethan Clark Foundation for Rebuilding Trust officially launched 6 months later. Named for someone who had helped me through one of my darkest moments, the foundation became the centerpiece of our efforts. We provided legal aid, counseling, and resources for people recovering from financial and emotional manipulation. The network of auto shops became safe havens, places where people could find not just repairs but support and understanding. My mission had evolved into something larger than myself. It wasn't just about escaping my past. It was about building a future where others didn't have to suffer the way I had. In the end, the fight against Keller wasn't about revenge. It was about redemption, rebuilding, and resilience. As I stood in the shop that night, the hum of tools and the laughter of my team filling the air, I felt something I hadn't in years. Peace. The past was behind me, The future was mine to build.